So there's been a lot of news lately about these ICE immigration raids, so we thought we'd break down immigration reform in 2016 by the numbers. So ICE steps up raids is where we begin. Moving on. There are undocumented immigrants in the United States. That's not really news, but in 2014, there are an estimated 11 million undocumented folks living here in the U.S. You can see that a lot of them are Mexican, and among the 6 states where the most are, of course, New York City is among one of the top homes of immigrants who are undocumented here in the States. Moving on, deportation facts. They're 9 times the rate of the 20 years ago. President Obama, in his tenure in office in the past 8 years, has deported some 2 million undocumented folks, earning him the moniker Deporter-in-Chief famously. Moving on here to our last slide. In New York City, there are 2 bills underway to protect undocumented immigrants in our city. The NYPD corrections is to ignore federal detainer requests, meaning if the feds send down an order, the NYPD is in charge with going to get folks. And at our main correctional facility, Rikers Island, they've actually removed ICE officers from the jail. So in summary, here in New York State, in New York City specifically, we're what's known as a sanctuary city. We'll get into that. President Obama has a sort of abysmal record on deporting folks, and ICE is coming. Back to Greg.
Yeah, amid rumors and reports of a fresh wave of immigration raids in New York, the inevitable question becomes, is the city really a sanctuary for undocumented immigrants? Our 2 guests will help us answer that question. Joining us now are Francis Maddy, Regional Outreach Associate at the New York Immigration Coalition. Francis, welcome to BK Live. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Of course. And Abraham Paulus, the Executive Director of Families for Freedom. Thank you both for coming in and being here on BK Live. Definitely. We want to talk about this. Let's start with this. Is New York City really a sanctuary city? Francis, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Definitely. New York City is one of the most important sanctuary cities in the United States. Usually, people tend to come to cities like New York City, San Francisco, because they tend to feel much more protected than other parts of the states. I know Abraham probably knows about this much more. He works with New York City communities often.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that New York City is probably a sanctuary city for undocumented immigrants. I do want to make one clarification as we move forward as far as like language and definitions. Those that are deportable are essentially non-citizens who are either undocumented or non-citizens, such as green card holders, who've had contact with the criminal system. So it's not just undocumented immigrants. So New York does a really great job for undocumented immigrants. But as far as being a sanctuary city for those that have green cards and let's say have some type of criminal conviction, either past or they're going through it right now, New York City doesn't really hold up that well.
So are there any, as I was told, there are about 320 municipalities across the nation who have this sort of sanctuary city classification. Are there others that do give exemption to folks who've bumped up against the criminal justice system?
Well, there is a movement, and that's where that detainer bill comes in that you guys just mentioned, right? And that movement is basically to say, we need to separate these 2 systems, the criminal justice system and the deportation and detention. So there is a movement to try to separate these 2 things. I think that, is there a city out there that actually like exemplifies? I think Philadelphia is doing some interesting things and some creative stuff with the mayor down there. But I think that as a whole, as far as like the conversation goes, deportation is still being put in this sort of, I guess, category around undocumented immigrants, and that's not really doing New York City and New Yorkers really a favor. Because a lot of New Yorkers that do get deported and have been deported actually come through the criminal legal system. And a lot of them were green card holders, Jamaicans, folks from the Caribbean, Trinidadians, Africans.
So there's an entire national fugitive operation like force that specifically goes after people who were involved or gotten into the criminal justice system. Is there a wall between those folks and like their separate operations versus what we think of as the ICE people?
So, not really. Usually the lines are very blurred when it comes to separating a criminal background from someone that has a clean record.
Right.
And usually ICE tends to target everyone in general,
Right.
regardless of whether they've been in jail before or even in a detention center.
Gotcha.
And I would just going off along with that. I mean, I think that it's really also important to talk about Barack Obama's speech November 20th, 2014, where he essentially announced a new program called Priority Enforcement Program that's been live since 2014. And the raids in New York City have actually increased since then. And what those new priorities are is that folks that have gotten through the criminal system.
So going after the bad guys, essentially, is what the speech boils down to.
It depends on what you consider a bad guy. I mean, in New York, there's 1 in 9 New Yorkers that have been convicted of a crime in the last 10 years. Do we call all these, New Yorkers bad guys? I don't think so. And then also in New York, 1 in 3 are foreign born. So you're really looking at a situation where, where New York has a very precarious criminal justice system, particularly with the New York Police Department and the bang up job that they do. And also, the court system. So I think that to just be black and white and say these are bad guys really doesn't reflect the problems we have with the criminal legal system.
Not to mention that the recent announcements by ICE in December to target Central American families, including mothers and children, people that usually don't have technically a criminal record. Maybe some of them were stopped by were placed in a detention center when they came through the border, but many of them are escaping violence.
The rapists and drug dealers
No, they're
that
not.
some would have us to believe.
Right. These are families. They escape violence. They want to live in a safe haven, and we're sending them back to these dangerous places. And so we have to draw the lines between those that have criminal records, and also take a look at what have they really done, and can we give them an opportunity to live in this country again?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we want to be real careful around that line between those that don't have criminal convictions and those that do, because we're going to get into the situation where we're at right now. Raids in New York have been happening since March 2015, but because they've been sort of targeted enforcement. These are long-term residents, by the way, New Yorkers. This has increased since March of 2015. There's been a lot of raids that have been happening. But now, since there's been a conversation sort of around the Central American refugee population, which really there is no evidence to show that it's happened in New York City, right? It's just been an announcement. It's been literally a rumor, but there are raids that are happening. And so I think that if we have that conversation around saying, let's talk about the raids in general, protect all New Yorkers, protect all families, instead of doing the job of ICE, which is to come up with other priorities. And going back to the Central American refugees, they were also a priority under the Priority Enforcement Program. So it was those that have had contact with the criminal system and recent arrivals, which the Central American population fits that bill.
Going back to spring of 14.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I want to talk more about the federal policies and the raids here in New York, but also hear about your individual organizations. How does Families for Freedom work, for example? How do you operate there?
So Families for Freedom, I mean, basically what we are folks that are directly affected by deportation and detention and their loved ones. So we support our folks, we educate our folks, and we do advocacy. I myself am also directly affected by deportations. I'm a non-citizen green card holder with a criminal past. So what we try to do is actually uplift the most vulnerable in our community, so then that way we're all safe, particularly also with our Central American brothers and sisters.
Sure. So the New York Immigration Coalition, it's a umbrella organization for about 150 groups in the state of New York. We advocate for immigrants on the federal, on the state, and on the local level. I, for example, work between New York City and Long Island. And so a lot of my work, it's very different in both places, and deportations they just happen so much often in Long Island that you would see in New York City. And so it is important that we also think of New York as a state, and then that we considered, the whole area in the map.
So if there's an estimated 100,000 plus folks who, mostly women and children, who were escaping violence in Central America, who came in that spring, and a lot of unaccompanied minors who came over, and if 112 folks have been deported in these raids, we're talking literally about 1/10%. So why is this making so much news now?
That's I mean, Francis, do you want to go at this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this is in a way a political move, that it's being fueled by the fact that, for example, we have DAPA and DACA right now in the Supreme Court. There is a huge anti-immigrant sentiment going on around the country. We have political candidates that are, fueling this hate, and I feel that this was a response to the hate, just to like let everyone know, like, oh, we are enforcing the laws in this country, and unfortunately, these families are going to be separated because of it, and we're trying to not let this happen.
Exactly. I mean, I also think that, there's the intention part, which is really hard for me to like figure out what was the intention of making an announcement. And a lot of times when they do raids, they don't make an announcement, such as the raids in New York City. I also do think that, going off to what she's saying, I think the 121 families, which is, a pretty big, it's human beings and it's families that we're talking about. But also, compare that number with New York City and the raids that they do. 121 families in New York, they could do that in a week, no problem. And they've been doing that, actually.
Right.
So the raids are happening in New York City. The issue then is that they're not politically, I guess, great to talk about, because it's people that have gone through the criminal system. And a last point about the home raids. These are home raids that are happening without a warrant to come inside the home, right? So they're essentially, it's in my mind, not only is it just wrong, but they might be unlawful, because the issue of saying that, is there a consent to open the door? So I really just want to remind your viewers that essentially what we're talking about is a really, really precarious legal situation in which ICE, working with the NYPD and the DOC, giving out our information, shows up at people's houses at 5 to 8 in the morning, waking up daughters, waking up people's son. Over.
At the same time, there's not a lot of sympathy on the other side if people are coming from the view that if you are here undocumented and you're not legally here, then why should you be afforded rights to not have someone come to your door at 5 and say, all right, we told you you've had an action that you have to be back. You've overstayed this grace period, so now it's time to go.
Well, but then the question becomes, so then does that mean that they can overstep the Constitution, right? So there's still laws.
But the Constitution is for whom? For citizens?
No, it is not. It is for everyone that lives in the United States and its territory, all persons that live in there. So I am protected by the Constitution, just like everyone else in this room. That's my first point about that. And then the second point about that is not like a situation, we're really talking about papers. Immigration and Customs Enforcement before 2003 was the Immigration Naturalization Services. These folks weren't really armed with like weapons in the 90s or in the 80s. They were armed with pieces of paper and pens.
So what necessitated the weapons then?
I think 9/11 really kind of heightened it, right? George Bush and sort of this fear-mongering that they were.
Before and after.
Right. And we're really talking about fear and what makes an immigrant, right, scary. And I do think that there's a lot of things, particularly around the conversation with who has a criminal conviction, who doesn't have a criminal conviction, right? What that then says is that we then condone the criminal justice system the way that it is. And now that there's a movement that says, you know what? It's called the new Jim Crow now. Like, actually, we need to take a step back and say, is this system actually doing us a favor as a society by determining who can be a part of society and who can't be a part of society? So I would disagree. I would say that, actually, no. I don't care what that person has gone through. There are other remedies, legal remedies, that have been in place for hundreds of years in this country with immigration. To say that now, we're allowed to come to your house at 5 and 8 in the morning, I think is wrong, because they're not allowed to come in the house.
And I would also just quickly add that starting in 1996, we also saw a lot of these enforcement laws start to spread out around the country. And it just started, in a way, it created a very harmful environment, because immigrants started to become, just one more criminal just because they were crossing the border.
Absolutely. And the
We're
person
totally
that
out of time.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to go off. Hillary.
I had a list of questions. I don't even think I said a word.
I was going to go off on Hillary and her husband, Bill, because, it was the war on drugs, and it was the war on...
We're going to talk during this package.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you, Abraham.
No problem.
Francis, thank you both very much for being here. Great job. Yeah.